So how much do you know about the biggest global health problems affecting our world? Most of us are familiar with the plight of HIV, TB, malaria. Some of you might have even given money towards these causes. But there's a big global health problem that doesn't really receive the recognition that it deserves, and that's anemia, caused by a lack of iron in the diet. And more than 2 billion people on this planet are anemic, largely women of reproductive age and their children. The standard treatment for anemia is iron supplements, either in the form of pills or powders that usually need to be taken every single day. And they're not without their consequences. There's many side effects, and people tend not to like taking iron supplements, and as a result, compliance is typically quite low. In addition, they're often quite expensive and far out of reach for hundreds of millions of people that need them the most. And so I've devoted my adult life to trying to change that, to trying to make treatment as accessible as possible around the world. After finishing my undergraduate degree in health science in Canada, I took a bold step, and I moved to Cambodia. I packed my dorm room up into a suitcase, and I traveled 14,000 kilometers to the hot, dusty, and crowded streets of Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia. I quickly moved to a remote rural village. There were about 800 people that lived in my village, and almost all of them subsisted on rice farming or fishing in the lakes and rivers that dotted the landscape. I moved into a typical Cambodian hut, much like the one shown here. It was raised off the ground about 10 feet with a simple slatted bamboo floor and walls and a tin roof that roared when the rain fell. I quickly moved to a remote rural village. There were about 800 people that lived in my village, and almost all of them subsisted on rice farming or fishing in the lakes and rivers that dotted the landscape. My job at the time was to screen for anemia and treat parasitic infections as I came across them. I then took blood samples from the neighboring villagers, and I was able to quantify the problem. The best national estimate suggested that a little over 50% of women and children in Cambodia would be anemic, but I was actually finding rates closer to 90%. Everywhere I went, people were laying in every inch of shade that they could find. No one had any energy. No energy to work, no energy to play, no energy to learn. And iron is essential in the development of the human brain and body. In science, we often learn that the simplest answer is the best, but that concept tends to get forgotten in real life. And so I charged myself and those around me with finding a solution to the problem, a simple solution, one that would be cost-effective, one that would be environmentally sustainable, and one that would be accessible to even the most remote rural villagers. And so I began poring over medical journals, and eventually I had a breakthrough one day. I discovered a series of experiments that looked at the use of iron cooking pots as a way to treat anemia. The concept is really quite simple. If you cook food in an iron cooking pot, some of the iron leaches from the food and fortifies each and every meal. So in theory, we had a really great treatment option here, but in practice, it didn't quite work out. Iron pots are expensive. They're heavy. People don't really like to use them. And on top of that, in the developing world where people don't have access to drawers of Tupperware, people who cook food typically leave it in the cooking pot overnight until it's eaten. If you leave food in an iron cooking pot, it spoils. And so I thought there must be a way to add iron to the cooking pot, and then the iron could then be removed. The iron needed to be added to any type of cooking pot, whether it be the aluminum ones like they use in Cambodia, whether it be clay or steel. It had to be cheap, it had to be effective at releasing iron, and it had to be environmentally sustainable. And so, the lucky iron fish was born. And here it is. We started off with a few different prototypes in the early months. It didn't always end up as this iron fish. First, we started off with an iron bar, a plain iron bar. And it did tick all the boxes. It was cheap and it was effective. It did release lots of iron, except there were huge problems with it. Everywhere I went, different families had found some use for it, just not in the cooking pots. People were using it as a doorstop, as a paperweight, even to prop up a table with a broken leg. I mean, I saw everything. So then I moved on to a disc, something that was a little bit more attractive, maybe ease some concerns that the iron bar might harm people's cooking pots, but it still didn't really make sense. So next idea. Finally, fish sprang to mind. Cambodia is a country that relies entirely on fish. The mighty Mekong River that dominates the countryside provides a livelihood and food source for millions of people. Fish is typically eaten at almost every meal, certainly every day, and the underlying flavor to almost all Cambodian dishes is a type of fish paste called prahok. So it's essentially made by taking sardines and grinding them up, heavily salting it, and then laying it in the sun for days to weeks on end in order to ferment and acquire this distinctive flavor. I'm sure you can imagine it's an acquired taste. And so I knew that fish made more sense. And interestingly, fish in Cambodia also are associated with luck. And I finally had something. So I tried a few different iterations of the fish design. The first was too big, the second was too bulky. The third, well, it was a little bit ugly. And so we had to keep reeling and changing the design over and over. And eventually we landed on this particular species of fish that's called tricantrop in local dialect. We slapped a cartoon-like smile on the fish, and we had an instant success. Understanding the human link here was key to solving this problem. Scientists often work in silos, and we tend to forget why we're doing what we're doing and how it impacts people's lives. And we needed to have a detailed understanding of nutrition, of anthropology, of public health, and of medicine, all within the Cambodian context to solve this problem. We had to embrace the complexity of the problem. So to make sure that the ironfish actually worked, we had to subject them to a battery of tests. First, we needed to make sure that they didn't contain any heavy metal contaminants. After we were confident that we weren't going to do more harm than good, we needed to see how much iron was actually going to be released from the ironfish. And so I took a batch of them back to my research lab in Canada, and I prepared several different varieties of soup and water, and then I subjected that to metal analysis to see how much iron was actually being released. And the results were absolutely astounding. We calculated that by consuming just 1 liter of boiled drinking water or soup every day, a person could meet just 75% of their iron requirements. And that's not taking into account any of the iron that might be in the food to begin with. But we still had to test to see whether people would accept it. We distributed ironfish, about 400 of them, to 5 different test communities. And we asked women to use them every single day when they were preparing their boiled water or their soup. We took blood samples on day 1, and then at 3 months, the fish truly were a success. Today, the ironfish are being produced at a mass scale, and we've just added a small little element to the design. We now have a small tracking number so that we can ensure that they're made of high quality, and we can keep track of when the different batches were made. The Lucky Ironfish Project is now registered as a social venture in Cambodia, and we actually employ a team of Cambodian representatives who travel across villages, spreading word about the lucky ironfish, talking about nutrition, about anemia, and about all these different health consequences that can result. The ironfish are purchased nominally by those who can afford them, and they're given to those who can't.